today's video, or the two parts of today's video, will be on the racism in Zimbabwe, or the conversation that needs to be had about the racism in Zimbabwe, seeing that people seem to only think that racism is in America. So yeah, I just thought to have this conversation. I've always wanted to have this conversation, but I think what exacerbated the whole thing, I guess, or accelerated the whole process was, of course, the Black Lives Matter protests and movement. And yeah, I was still gathering information and stuff like that, and I saw a thread on Twitter by @midnight_is_a_place. I will try my best to link the thread and her account in the description box below so that you guys can see what I saw and was like, yeah, this needs to be a thing. So yeah, let's get into it. Okay, so we'll begin with the definitions of racism that I have here. I was going to insert an image, but they were on my phone, which got stolen along with my laptop. If you followed me on Twitter, you'd know that. But yeah, So I luckily, smart me, wrote down the two definitions of racism that I will be working with. And the first one goes as this. Racism is the belief in distinct human races, and that they have different inherent attributes or abilities, and generally that some are superior and others inferior. I will repeat. The belief in distinct human races and that they have different inherent attributes or abilities, and generally that some are superior and others inferior. The second definition I have is the policy, practice, or program of promoting this belief and promoting the dominance of one race over others. So that's in reference to the first definition I gave. I will repeat. The policy, practice, or program of promoting this belief and promoting the dominance of one race over others. So for me, the first one is more of a social, definition. By the way, this is just me grouping them, and it's very, very loose. But for me, the first definition is has more of a social aspect to it, and then the second one has more of an institutional/systemic feel to it. I will say that in Zimbabwe, there's a lot more social racism compared to institutional racism. Both are there, but more so we have interpersonal racism or interpersonal racism. And if you see me referring to interpersonal, institutional, systemic racism, it is because there are known to be 4 levels of racism, and I will explain them, don't worry. But yeah. Okay, so these are the 4 levels of racism, and they have been divided into 2, which is micro levels of racism, macro levels of racism. Okay, in micro levels of racism, there is interpersonal racism. Interpersonal racism occurs between individuals. Once we bring our private beliefs into our interactions with others, racism is now in the interpersonal realm. So examples of this are public expression of racial prejudice, hate, bias, and bigotry between individuals. Then there is internalized racism, which is internalized racism lies within individuals and groups. It is a multi-generational process of dehumanization that can manifest as internalized inferiority for people of color and as internalized superiority and privilege for white people. So examples of this are xenophobia, ethnocentrism, internalized privilege, and internalized inadequacy. So now with micro levels of racism, it's got to do with yourself and your interactions with other people. So with interpersonal racism, it says it occurs between individuals. So it's more of an outward thing in comparison to internalized racism. Internalized racism is racism that we project to other people in relation to how we view ourselves as a race, if that makes sense. Anyways, I think the explanations are simple enough. I don't even know why I'm explaining again. Anyways, now we're going to macro levels of racism. Institutional racism. Institutional racism occurs within institution. It is discriminatory treatment, unfair policies and practices, and inequitable opportunities and impacts based on race. So the example is a school system that concentrates people of color in the most overcrowded, underfunding schools with the least qualified educators. The last level of racism that we're going to look at is structural racism. And it says, structural racism is racial bias across institutions and society. It is the cumulative and compounded effects of a variety of factors that systematically privilege white people and disadvantage people of color. Examples are the racial wealth divide, where white people have many times the wealth of people of color, which results from generations of discrimination, is the result of many generations of genocide, displacement, violence, forced and exploited labor, and discriminatory and exclusionary policies and practices. So in general, with these levels of racism, you can now, as a person, whatever race you are, like I said, anyone from any race can be a victim of racism, can be complicit in racism, and can be racist. Okay. So with these levels of racism, you can just kind of do some introspection and see where you fall in, if you do at all. Maybe you're not part and parcel of any of these things. Well, then good for you. But I think seeing these definitions and the examples of how they can play out will help people realize how racism is not just a violent act, which I'll talk about later. But yeah, do some introspection, see whether or not your behaviors correlate with the behaviors described here, and hold yourself accountable. This is not the time for guilt or for blame, but the time for accountability. You're probably wondering why I'm making this video, but I think it's because people don't realize that racism is a global crisis. And last time I checked, Zimbabwe was part of the globe. So we are also responsible for the racism that occurs within our borders and the racism that we permit, or even the racism we encourage, whether it be within our borders or without. But in terms of the conversation about racism within our borders, I want to point out that it is my belief that it is mostly due to undealt with effects on colonization. I'm bringing up colonization. But yeah, I think we really need to have a conversation about colonization, not just facts, but the trauma that some people faced, the mindsets that have carried over from the pre-independence, the traumas not dealt with. I think I said that already. The stigmas, the discrimination, the perceptions we have of other people based on sort of the groundwork created or begun, that had been begun in colonial times. And I will say this, I wrote down here that I believe that we need to have a constructive conversation about post-colonial Zimbabwe so that we can start effective change against social and institutional racism. And so you'll see there, I said we need to have a constructive conversation about post-colonial Zimbabwe so that we can start effective change against racism. So I believe that we really need to have that conversation because a lot of the racism that we're dealing with right now in Zimbabwe is due to undealt issues stemming from colonization. And so we really, really need to fix that. Okay, I also want to say something before we carry on this video, and I wrote it in bold on the paper that I'm reading from. It's a clipboard, by the way. It's a clipboard. So yeah, it says, anyone from any race can be racist and be a victim of racism, even within the same lifetime or period of time. I also want to add that anyone from any race can be complicit in racism. So basically what I'm saying is everybody and their mama can be racist. Everybody and their mama can be a victim of racism. And everybody and their mother can be the cause of why we have racism rampant in our streets, in terms of not speaking out, in terms of not calling out people and their racist behaviors, or just allowing their behavior to grow rampant, either due to being scared of reproach or just being in general ignorant. So I say this because there are some ideas about racism that need to be fixed, and I will explain them very soon. I will explain them. Now, I want to say that in terms of this conversation that I hope we'll eventually have, there are some stumbling blocks or some things that are preventing us from having this constructive conversation that I think we need to have. And these stumbling blocks really need to be dealt with in order for us to really feel, for all of us to feel safe in this conversation, and to bring meaning to the conversation, and to steer the conversation towards change that benefits everyone, that does not leave anyone behind. The first stumbling block, or the first barrier that we have in between us and the conversation that we need to have, is that people's views about racism are limited, or their definition of racism is limited. And what I mean by that is that a lot of people only see racism as occurring between white people and black people, specifically white actions against black lives. And so even though that is a prevalent issue right now, the problem with this is that for a lot of other races, they don't see themselves in that sort of idea of racism, and therefore they do not include themselves in the conversation when everybody needs to be in the conversation. It's either they don't see themselves as valued in the conversation, or they don't see themselves as racist because they do not fit the description of those that are usually racist. Okay, I don't know why I did the second air quotes, but what I mean by that is you have non-black people of color, or you have other races in Zimbabwe that are not white, that are not black, that don't come forth in the conversation, because for them racism is only confined between black and white people. Therefore they don't feel the need to add on to the conversation. They don't feel the need to change if they are exhibiting racist behaviors, because they believe it is outside of them. And that is a problem. And remember, I said anyone from any race can be racist, can be a victim of racism, and be complicit in racism in any given lifetime, in the same lifetime or in the same period of time. And the reason why I said that is to include everyone in the conversation. Zimbabwe is made up of multiple races, and we all need to be in this conversation in order for it to be effective. And unfortunately, to have a limited view of racism excludes people from that conversation. The second obstacle between us and having this conversation is that people are tired of talking about racism. A lot of people don't like the fact that this conversation keeps coming up in our national discourse. It's either because they have to relive their traumas when talking about this, or they are forced to be face to face. Is that even English? They're forced to come face to face with their own sins, or they feel as if they're being put in, the spotlight. I think we keep on having this conversation for two reasons. Number one, because this conversation needs to be had continuously. Racism is not something that you talk about once and you conquer forever. It is an ugly thing that comes into our lives time and time again, and therefore we need to talk about it and really try and stand against it time and time again. The second reason why we keep having this conversation is that every time we have or we try to have a conversation about the racism in Zimbabwe, which is largely due to colonial residue, is because we don't have this conversation effectively, or we don't have a constructive conversation. The conversation is either done sloppily, it excludes other people, it is a very abrasive and accusational type of conversation, and therefore people drop the conversation. But the problem still persists. So we're like, okay, let's start the conversation again. But again, because the conversation is not, I guess, moderated or really, what can I say? It's not really had in a safe place that is allowing of people to share their stories, that is allowing people or forcing people to have an open mind. Because that conversation doesn't happen that way, it becomes, destroyed, and we keep on having to regurgitate the whole thing again. So basically what I'm trying to say, because I feel like I just confused you guys, is that the conversation is not done well, and therefore it needs to be restarted. And it can be very frustrating to redo something that ends up being rubbish and then being told to do it again. People are just like, look, we keep talking about this, nothing happens, so what's the point? But I think that that's one of the reasons why people are tired about talking, or tired of talking about racism. The third reason why people are, or the third barrier we have in terms of between us and the conversation, is that a lot of people are scared of an admission of guilt. When talking about racism, what tends to happen if you're being presented with facts is that sometimes, in fact, all of the time, I think for all people, we come across behaviors that we ourselves exhibit, racist behaviors, be it perpetuating stereotypes or having biases towards or against people, prejudices, microaggressions, or stuff like that. We start to see some of the ways in which we ourselves are racist. People seem to only want to talk about racism when they're the victims, and never when somebody else is the victim, or never when somebody else is crying out. And I think that's what this stumbling block is that we never want to see, or we never talk about racism outside of the scope as us being the victims, be Black people, white people, colored people, Indian people. When it comes to admitting our guilt or admitting our role in perpetuating this behavior, our role in being racist, we then want to, exit the conversation, because in life, it's never nice, or it's never a good thing to be found guilty of doing something. And so instead of facing that and being remorseful and willing to change, a lot of people would rather avoid feeling guilty. By the way, this conversation, to have a conversation about racism, is not to make anyone feel guilty. Your guilt does nothing for anyone. And I see this sometimes where people feel as if that when we talk about colonization, we want white people to feel guilty. No, You didn't do it. Well, if you were born in 1980, like, it, you didn't do it. Do you get me? And so you feeling guilty, in my opinion, just doesn't make any sense, because it's not for you to feel guilty about. However, the conversation is meant for each and every one of us to take accountability for our actions and the effects they have. And unfortunately, people think that guilt and accountability are synonymous or are the same thing. And up and until we separate those two, it will be very difficult to ask people to hold themselves accountable without they themselves automatically believing that to mean that we want them to feel guilty. The fourth stumbling block we have against the conversation that we need to have about racism is that people only see racism as a violent act. They don't see racism as words, or not, let me not say words, but as something that can be insidious, that can be subtle, that can be implied. They only think of racism as having an outward violent act against someone else. They never see it as what it truly is. And so they even if you point out to somebody that they're being racist, maybe in a conversation or through a joke, they'll tell you, oh, it's just a joke. Or they'll tell you, oh, you're being too much, when you know deep down you're correct, right? And so people tend not to join the conversation because they have, like I said in the first stumbling block, they have a limited view of what racism is. And so they still think that racism only falls under violent acts. When you try to have a conversation about racism and you point out stuff like microaggressions, it becomes very, very hard to convince people that they should, prevent such behavior from happening, or racist behavior from happening, microaggressions from happening, that they should hold themselves accountable for stuff that they don't believe is a bad thing. So that in of itself is a very, very hard thing to overcome. And that's what leads to the general butchery of the conversation, is that people don't see racism as anything else but violent. And therefore, sometimes people get defensive, they start to think you're being ridiculous, and that's not helpful at all. In general, those obstacles are very real obstacles, and we need to deal with them in terms of trying to really have a constructive conversation about post-colonial Zimbabwe in order to have effective change against all levels of racism in Zimbabwe. And I do want to reiterate, anyone from any race can be a victim of racism, can be complicit in racism, and can be racist themselves. And therefore, I really say that so that we all realize that we belong in this conversation. Yeah, I think this is the end of the video. Yes. Anyways, don't forget to like, to subscribe, and to comment down below what you think of this video. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Instagram at Naledi_Dilena. Also, there's a part 2 to this video that will be up probably the same time as this video is up. So if you're watching this, it means that video is also up, and you can go straight over there. It's in that video I am doing a voiceover mainly of the thread that I was talking about by At Midnight Is a Place, display name being Belinda. Forgot the surname of the display name. But yeah, check that thread out, check that video out, and comment down below what you really think so that we can have a conversation about this. I really, really do think that we need to, fix this country, and not just economically. I think sometimes what happens with this conversation is that we get so distracted by everything else. You know, people have this thing like, oh, we've got bigger issues. And that may be very true. Yeah, we have bigger issues, but we still have many other issues to deal with, big or small. So yeah, we shouldn't neglect this issue. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, were informed, truly learned something, and I will see you in part 2.